The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat across from Mr. Henderson, watching him shuffle through papers with the enthusiasm of a man reading grocery lists. My grandfather's will was being read, and so far, my cousins had received the farmhouse, the good land, and the cattle. I waited, wondering what scraps were left for me. "And to my grandson Michael," Henderson cleared his throat, "I leave my 1952 Ford 8N tractor, currently located in the old barn." My cousin Jake snorted from across the room. "That piece of junk, engine seized up 10 years ago, hasn't run since Bush was president, the first one." The family erupted in muffled laughter. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. But I remembered that tractor differently. As a boy, I'd spent countless summer afternoons riding on Grandpa's lap as we worked the fields. His weathered hands would guide mine on the steering wheel, teaching me about responsibility, hard work, and the value of taking care of what you have. That tractor wasn't just metal and rust to me. It held memories worth more than any monetary value my family could assign. Walking out of that office, I made a decision that would surprise everyone, including myself. I was going to restore that tractor, not because I needed it, but because Grandpa had trusted me with it. Maybe he saw something in me that others didn't. Maybe he knew I'd be the only one willing to put in the work to bring it back to life. The drive to the old farm felt longer than usual, each mile taking me further from my family's laughter and closer to understanding why Grandpa had left me what everyone else considered worthless. The barn door creaked on rusty hinges, protesting as I forced it open. Dust particles danced in the late afternoon sunlight, streaming through gaps in the weathered boards. There she sat, my inheritance, covered in years of neglect and surrounded by forgotten farm equipment. The Ford 8N looked worse than I remembered. Rust had claimed large sections of the hood and fenders. The tires were flat and cracked, the seat cushions split and bleeding foam stuffing. Weeds had grown up around the wheels, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim this piece of machinery. I ran my hand along the fender, feeling the rough texture of oxidized metal beneath my palm. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Seen your treasure yet? Hope you're good with a welding torch." I ignored it and walked around the tractor, taking inventory of the damage. The engine was indeed seized, the hydraulics had leaked fluid all over the barn floor, and several essential parts were missing entirely. Any reasonable person would have walked away. The cost of restoration would far exceed the tractor's finished value, but as I stood there in that dusty barn, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice. "Michael, anything worth having is worth working for. This old girl's got plenty of life left in her. She just needs someone who cares enough to find it." I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting every angle, every problem, every challenge that lay ahead. This wasn't just about fixing a tractor anymore. This was about proving that some things have value beyond dollars and cents, that legacy isn't always about what you inherit, but what you choose to do with it. By the time I left that barn, my clothes were dusty and my hands were dirty, but my resolve was stronger than ever. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about the 1952 Ford 8N. Online forums, restoration guides, parts catalogs, I absorbed it all, like a man studying for the most important exam of his life. The more I learned, the more I realized the magnitude of what I was attempting. The parts list alone was daunting. New engine components, hydraulic seals, wiring harness, tires, seat, paint. The costs added up quickly. My wife Sarah watched me scribble numbers on a notepad at the kitchen table, her expression growing more concerned with each calculation. "Honey," she said gently, placing her hand on my shoulder, "maybe your cousins were right. Maybe it's time to let this go." I looked up at her, seeing the practical wisdom in her eyes, but also feeling the weight of something I couldn't quite explain. "Sarah, I know it doesn't make financial sense, But Grandpa didn't leave me this tractor because it was valuable. He left it because he knew I'd be the one to value it. She squeezed my shoulder and smiled. Then we better figure out how to do this right. That evening, I called my old friend Tommy, who ran a small engine repair shop in town. If anyone could help me assess the real condition of that Ford, it would be him. We arranged to meet at the barn Saturday morning. I also reached out to my neighbor, Earl, who had been farming longer than I'd been alive. Earl had restored several vintage tractors over the years and might be willing to share some wisdom. The farming community was tight-knit, and despite the jokes about my worthless inheritance, I knew there were people who understood the real value of preserving these old machines. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Tomorrow would mark the real beginning of this journey. Tommy arrived Saturday morning with a toolbox that had seen more miles than most cars and a skeptical expression that matched my family's reaction. Earl pulled up right behind him in his pickup, climbing out with the deliberate movements of a man who'd spent 70 years working with his hands. "Well," Tommy said, circling the tractor like a doctor examining a patient, "she's definitely seen better days." He started pointing out problems I hadn't even noticed. Cracked engine block, bent steering components, compromised frame integrity in several places. Earl was quieter, running his weathered fingers along various parts with the reverence of someone who understood the craftsmanship of a bygone era. "They don't make them like this anymore," he murmured, almost to himself. "Earl," I asked, "be honest with me. Is this worth attempting?" He straightened up slowly, looking me directly in the eyes. "Son, that depends on what you mean by worth it. If you're talking about money, then no. You'll never break even on this project. But if you're talking about something that can't be measured in dollars," he paused, placing his hand on the tractor's hood. "Your grandfather and I used to work our fields side by side. This old girl earned her keep for 30 good years. She deserves a chance to do it again." Tommy's assessment was more practical, but not entirely discouraging. "The engine can be rebuilt, but it'll take time and patience. Most of the hydraulics need replacement, but the pump housing looks salvageable. The transmission seems solid. That's the expensive part if it goes bad." By the end of the morning, I had a realistic timeline of about 6 months and a parts list that would cost more than my last vacation. But I also had something more valuable: 2 experienced men willing to help me bring this machine back to life. The real work began the following weekend. Tommy had lent me an engine hoist, and Earl showed up with his grandson Danny, a college kid who needed community service hours and wasn't afraid of getting dirty. We started by draining all the fluids and removing every component that could come off. Each part told a story of the tractor's working life. The wear patterns on the clutch showed thousands of hours of field work. The scratches on the loader arms revealed encounters with rocks, fence posts, and stubborn tree stumps. Even the rust seemed to have character, creating unique patterns across the metal surfaces. "Your grandfather was meticulous about maintenance," Earl observed, pointing to recent grease fittings and evidence of regular oil changes right up until the tractor's final breakdown. "This seizure probably happened because he stored it without proper preparation. Happens to the best of us." As we worked, Danny asked questions about farming, about the history of the land, about why anyone would put this much effort into an old tractor. His questions made me articulate things I hadn't fully understood myself. "It's about continuity," I found myself explaining while struggling with a stubborn bolt. This tractor was part of something bigger, a way of life, a connection to the land, a family legacy. When you restore something like this, you're not just fixing machinery. You're preserving a piece of history. By the end of the day, we had the engine completely removed and sitting on a stand. The tractor looked naked and vulnerable without its heart, but also ready for the transformation ahead. I took pictures to document our progress, already imagining the before and after photos I'd share once the project was complete. That night, I fell asleep with aching muscles and oil under my fingernails, but with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The engine block sat on my workbench like a patient waiting for surgery. Tommy had agreed to guide me through the rebuild process, teaching me skills I'd never thought I'd need. Rebuilding an engine is like solving a three-dimensional puzzle, he explained. Every piece has its place, and everything has to work together perfectly. We started with a complete teardown, cataloging each part and measuring everything for wear. The cylinder walls needed boring, the crankshaft required grinding, and the valves were beyond saving. But the engine block itself was solid, a testament to the quality of 1950s engineering. I spent evenings at the kitchen table, cleaning parts in solvent and studying repair manuals. Sarah would find me there hours later, surrounded by gaskets, springs, and small metal components arranged in careful order. "You know," she said one night, "I haven't seen you this focused on anything in years." She was right. My day job in insurance felt routine and predictable, but this project demanded everything I had: patience, problem-solving skills, physical strength, and a willingness to learn from my mistakes. Each small victory, like successfully honing a cylinder or properly setting valve clearances, felt like a genuine accomplishment. The machine shop work took 3 weeks. When I picked up the freshly bored block and ground crankshaft, I felt like I was collecting pieces of my grandfather's legacy, now renewed and ready for another lifetime of service. Earl stopped by to check on my progress and nodded approvingly at the rebuilt components. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said simply. "He always said the best way to honor good machinery was to take proper care of it." Slowly, methodically, we began reassembling the engine, each bolt torqued to specification, each gasket carefully positioned. While waiting for the engine parts to return from the machine shop, I decided to tackle the cosmetic restoration. The seat was in terrible condition, with torn vinyl and foam padding that crumbled to dust when touched. I'd found a replacement seat assembly online, but first I wanted to see if anything could be salvaged from the original. I carefully removed the old seat from its mounting bracket and carried it to my workshop. Using a utility knife, I began cutting away the deteriorated vinyl covering, planning to use the metal frame as a template for the replacement seat. As I peeled back the layers of padding, my knife hit something hard, not the metal spring base I expected, but something else, something that felt deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped. I worked more carefully, pulling away foam and fabric until I could see what was hidden beneath. It was a wrapped bundle about the size of a paperback book, carefully sealed in oilcloth and plastic bags. My heart began racing as I realized this had been intentionally concealed. With trembling hands, I cut through the protective layers, revealing an envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside the envelope were documents I'd never seen before: stock certificates, property deeds, and a handwritten letter dated just 3 months before Grandpa's death. The letter began, "Michael, if you're reading this, then you're the man I always believed you could be." I sat down heavily on my workshop stool, staring at documents that represented a fortune I never knew existed. But more than the monetary value, I was struck by the elaborate plan my grandfather had constructed to ensure these assets would go to the family member who would truly appreciate their worth. "You were always different from the others," his letter continued. "You understood that some things can't be bought or sold. They can only be earned through dedication and respect for what came before." The letter explained everything. Grandpa had been quietly accumulating assets for years: mineral rights, timberland, railroad stock that had appreciated enormously over the decades. But he'd also watched his family, seeing who valued money over relationships, who took shortcuts instead of doing things right, who would respect his legacy versus who would simply cash it in. "The tractor was my test," he wrote. "I knew that only someone who understood real value would bother to restore it." Only someone who respected the work of previous generations would put in the effort to bring it back to life. I hid these documents in the one place I was certain they'd be safe, inside something the wrong person would never bother to examine. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. The documents represented enough wealth to change my family's life completely, but the real treasure was understanding how deeply my grandfather had known and trusted me. He designed an elaborate test that would ensure his true legacy went to someone who would honor it properly. Sarah found me in the workshop 2 hours later, still sitting with the documents spread before me. When I explained what I'd discovered, she was quiet for a long moment. "He really knew you, didn't he?" she finally said. I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in my throat. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about being chosen, being trusted with something precious, being recognized for qualities I wasn't even sure I possessed. That night I called Tommy and Earl to share the news. Both men were amazed, but not entirely surprised. "Your grandfather was always planning 3 moves ahead," Earl chuckled. "Sounds exactly like something he'd do." The discovery of the hidden documents didn't change my commitment to finishing the tractor restoration. If anything, it made me more determined to do the job right. This machine had protected my inheritance for who knows how many years. The least I could do was restore it to its former glory. With the financial pressure removed, I was able to purchase higher quality parts and take the time to do everything properly. Instead of cutting corners with aftermarket components, I hunted down original Ford parts or the best available reproductions. The tractor deserved nothing less than authentic restoration. The engine rebuild was completed first. The moment we started it for the first time in over a decade was magical. The rebuilt Ford flathead came to life with a smooth, powerful rumble that brought tears to Earl's eyes. "That's exactly how she sounded when she was new," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Next came the hydraulic system overhaul. New seals, fresh fluid, careful adjustment of pressure settings. The loader arms moved smoothly for the first time in years, responding to controls with the precision the engineers had intended 70 years ago. The bodywork was painstaking but rewarding. Each piece was stripped to bare metal, rust was neutralized, and primer applied before the final coats of Ford blue paint. I found myself enjoying the meditative nature of the work. The steady rhythm of sanding, the careful application of paint, the gradual transformation from rust-covered relic to showpiece. Tommy helped with the electrical system, replacing the entire wiring harness and installing a new generator. "Modern tractors have computers," he observed, "but there's something beautiful about the simplicity of this old electrical system. Everything you need, nothing you don't." By spring, the restoration was nearly complete. I'd kept the project relatively quiet, working mostly on weekends in my garage and Earl's workshop. But as the restoration neared completion, word began to spread through our small farming community. Earl had been talking to neighbors about the amazing job I was doing, and curiosity was building. I decided to unveil the finished tractor at the annual County Fair's antique machinery display. It seemed fitting. Grandpa had won several awards at that same event with his farming equipment over the years. The fair would also give me an opportunity to share the tractor with people who would truly appreciate the work that had gone into its restoration. The morning of the fair, Tommy helped me load the Ford 8N onto a trailer for transport. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a rust-covered hulk was now a gleaming example of 1950s agricultural engineering. The Ford blue paint sparkled in the sunlight, chrome components shone like mirrors, and the engine purred with mechanical perfection. Sarah rode with me to the fairgrounds, and I could see the pride in her eyes as we unloaded the tractor. "I have to admit," she said, "when you started this project, I thought you were crazy. But seeing it now, understanding why your grandfather chose you, I couldn't be more proud." The reaction from other exhibitors was immediate and gratifying. Farmers who had known both my grandfather and this particular tractor gathered around, sharing stories and marveling at the quality of the restoration. Several judges for the antique machinery competition stopped by, asking detailed questions about the work that had been done. But the most meaningful moment came when Jake appeared, my cousin who had mocked the inheritance months earlier. He walked slowly around the tractor, examining every detail with grudging admiration. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I thought Uncle Henry had stuck you with a piece of junk. I didn't understand what he was really giving you." The Ford 8N took first place in the antique tractor restoration category, but more importantly, it became the centerpiece of conversations about preservation, family legacy, and the value of skilled craftsmanship. Farmers who had dismissed the project months earlier now sought me out for advice on their own restoration projects. Earl introduced me to the local chapter of the Early Day Gas Engine and Tractor Association, a group dedicated to preserving agricultural heritage. "We need young people like you," the chapter president explained. "People who understand that these machines represent more than just old technology. They're pieces of our history." Local newspaper ran a feature story about the restoration, focusing on the themes of family legacy and the importance of preserving agricultural heritage. The article included before and after photos that dramatically illustrated the transformation, but also quoted my grandfather's letter about the value of understanding real worth. I was invited to speak at several farming events, sharing not just the technical aspects of the restoration, but the deeper lessons I'd learned about patience, craftsmanship, and honoring the work of previous generations. These speaking opportunities connected me with other restoration enthusiasts and deepened my appreciation for the community of people who shared these values. The tractor also became a working member of our small hobby farm operation. Using it to maintain food plots, clear brush, and handle various property maintenance tasks felt like completing the circle. This machine was once again serving its intended purpose, continuing the legacy of useful work that had defined its original life. But perhaps most importantly, the project had changed how I viewed challenges and commitments. The skills I'd learned, the patience I'd developed, and the confidence I'd gained from completing something truly difficult had applications far beyond tractor restoration. The success of the restoration project and the revelation about the hidden documents created ripples throughout my extended family. Cousins who had barely acknowledged my existence suddenly wanted to rebuild relationships. But their motivations weren't always pure. Several approached me with investment opportunities or suggestions for how to maximize the value of Grandpa's assets. These interactions helped me understand even more clearly why Grandpa had structured his inheritance the way he did. He'd seen these same patterns during his lifetime. Family members who viewed everything through the lens of immediate monetary gain, who couldn't appreciate the intrinsic value of tradition, craftsmanship, or preserving something for future generations. I made decisions about the inheritance that honored Grandpa's intentions. The mineral rights revenue would fund a scholarship program for young people interested in agricultural careers. The timberland would remain undeveloped, managed for wildlife habitat and sustainable forestry practices. The stock investments would continue growing, providing long-term security for my family, while supporting companies that aligned with Grandpa's values. Jake eventually approached me privately, his attitude completely transformed from our initial encounter at the lawyer's office. "I've been thinking about what Uncle Henry did," he said. "He wasn't just leaving you money or property. He was passing on his values, making sure they'd continue with someone who would respect them." We had a long conversation about family, legacy, and the different ways people define success. Jake admitted that he'd been so focused on the immediate value of the inheritance that he'd missed the deeper meaning of what Grandpa was trying to accomplish. Other family members remained distant, perhaps uncomfortable with the implications of Grandpa's choices or resentful that they'd been found wanting by his standards. I felt sad about these strained relationships, but I also understood that I couldn't force people to value things they simply didn't understand. One of the most rewarding aspects of the restoration experience was the opportunity to share what I'd learned with younger people. Danny, Earl's grandson who had helped with the initial teardown, became genuinely interested in mechanical work and started spending more time in my workshop. "Mr. Michael," he asked one afternoon while helping me adjust the tractor's carburetor, "why did you spend so much money on something that wasn't worth fixing?" It was a perceptive question that got to the heart of everything I'd learned. "Danny, there are different kinds of value. This tractor might not be worth much money compared to a new one, but it represents something that can't be bought: craftsmanship, heritage, and respect for the people who came before us." I started teaching basic mechanical skills to Danny and several other young people in our community. We worked on small engines, learned welding basics, and discussed the principles of good maintenance and repair. But more than technical skills, I tried to pass on the attitudes and values that had made the Ford restoration meaningful. "When you take care of something properly," I explained during one of our sessions, "you're not just maintaining a machine. You're participating in a tradition of respect for good work and quality materials. You're connecting yourself to everyone who ever cared for that item before you." These teaching opportunities also helped me understand Grandpa's perspective more clearly. He'd spent decades trying to pass on his values to his children and grandchildren with mixed success. By creating the elaborate test with the tractor, he'd found a way to identify and reward someone who shared his beliefs about quality, persistence, and proper stewardship. Sarah often joined our workshop sessions, learning alongside the younger students and adding her own insights about project planning and attention to detail. These family workshops became some of our favorite times together, creating new traditions while honoring old ones. 2 years after that disappointing day in the lawyer's office, I found myself back at the family farm for a very different gathering. Earl was hosting the annual meeting of the Tractor Association, and dozens of restored machines were arranged in the same field where Grandpa had once worked with his Ford 8N. My restored tractor sat in the place of honor, its blue paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. But it wasn't just a static display. We'd used it that morning to help set up the event, moving equipment and materials with the same reliability that had characterized its original working life. The association members shared stories of their own restoration projects, and I realized that each machine represented someone's journey of discovery, patience, and connection to the past. The technical skills were important, but the real value lay in what these projects taught us about ourselves and our relationship to the generations who came before us. Jake brought his teenage son to the event, introducing him to the tractor and explaining the story of how it had transformed our family's understanding of true inheritance. "Your great-great-grandfather knew something we didn't," he told his son. "He understood that the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars." As the day wound down and members began loading their tractors for the trip home, Earl approached me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Michael, your grandfather would have loved seeing this. Not just the tractor, though he'd be proud of the work you did, but seeing how his lesson has spread to other people, especially the young ones." Driving home that evening with the Ford 8N secured on its trailer behind me, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since inheriting what everyone else considered worthless junk. The monetary value of the hidden documents had certainly improved our financial security, but the real treasure had been the journey itself, learning new skills, connecting with my community, and understanding the deeper meaning of legacy and stewardship. The broken tractor had taught me that the most valuable inheritances aren't always the most obvious ones. Sometimes what seems like a burden is actually a gift, and sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places where only the right person would think to look. Thank you so much for listening to this story about discovering that true value isn't always measured in dollars and cents. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and if you have any stories about discovering unexpected treasures or learning valuable lessons from older family members. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding meaning in unexpected places. And remember that sometimes the greatest inheritances are the ones that teach us who we really are.